Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you, Tom, 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 and Tom. Thank you all. And the trip to Wisconsin brought back wonderful memories. I'm from Wisconsin, a place called Janesville, Wisconsin. And I would suspect that given the description we had about ABS, that it would be a serious business that you'd like to own. Can you imagine owning the world's leader in bovine serum? This is probably one of the great businesses. In fact, speaking about great, I did have the pleasure of reading in the Lancaster News this morning the award that Lancaster received for being one of the coolest cities in the country. And so, raise a hand, come on. And I would tell you it's because of places like this, the sort of values that Lancaster keeps, that has allowed it to go to this sort of a position today where people revere it from all points of the world. What makes Lancaster extremely special from an investment standpoint is the predominance of family-controlled companies. Raise a hand here for those of you who actually have or work with a family-controlled company. This is one of the extraordinary features about Lancaster, and it's what I actually tap into as a money manager, as an investor. 70% of the companies in which I've invested are family-controlled. Most investors flee family-controlled in public companies for risks that the families may expropriate the money that belongs to the company for themselves. And in a controlled company, there's very little technical resistance to stop them from such actions. So you have to pick your families carefully and well. But when you get a family-controlled company, the protection that they give managements, public companies, to invest for the future at the expense of today is something that's really quite competitively advantaging. So Lancaster owns this unique characteristic of having so many companies that are within generations. Now, the trick is, we're going to talk about investing in public equities. I will talk about it through the guise of family-controlled public equities. But the trouble is, each of you who have a business, if you were to happen to sell the business, and in your own business on a daily basis, you think about things like, how do I make my business better for the future? What you don't think about in running your privately owned family company is how you can maximize your quarterly reported profits. How you might be, I was speaking to somebody recently about this topic, and he worked for Hewlett-Packard, and I described the fact that public companies, in an effort to meet Wall Street's ridiculous expectations of quarterly earnings, will take steps that actually damage future results, simply to make sure that near-term targets are met artificially in most cases. They either starve investment spending that should be applied and that might burden reported profits and build value, or they anticipate revenues. They ship things that they agree to the consumer can be sent back on refund. They do all the things, the games to play. But the truth is, if you're running your own business, the last thing you want to do is report massive quarterly earnings. You want to invest back in the business so that it becomes more wealthy for your heirs and assignees. That's sensible. If one of you sold your similarly set up privately owned company and went to Wall Street, you would find someone who promises you 9% a year every year, delivered in quarterly fashion, neat as can be, and of course it's completely fictitious, and the efforts to try to deliver such steadiness on Wall Street, which is what Wall Street sells, is very dangerous. But assume that you still all are not only invested in your own companies, but show me a hand of how many people here own no common stocks. Anybody here who's not an investor? Well, that's quite good. I was going to follow up and say, how many people here hold mutual funds? Great show of hands. Okay. So the point I was going to make there is, I will frequently visit with investors who say, I don't own stocks. I'm really nervous about the market. I don't own stocks. Fine. How about mutual funds? Oh yeah, I've got the S&P 500. So be careful. Anyways, one of the things that made me think of coming here to speak today is my deep respect for this institution's international roots. I have 70% of the funds that I oversee, almost $7 billion, invested in companies away from the United States. And the reason why the world is safe for such endeavors is because people like you have over the years invested in reach across to try to create goodwill among nations. Without this, there'd be no way that I would risk my investors' capital in search for returns that come from places as far away as China and India. But you're engaged as an entity in helping to drive that kind of outreach. I do appreciate that hard work that you do. To summarize, I would oversee roughly $10 billion, 75% of it's in non-US companies. 75% of that money is invested in the top 10 holdings, so we would have 3 or 4 positions that are over $1 billion. Tended to, by the way, by my trader who's in the audience, Brian Tate, who does an able job of waking up early and staying up late and helping us deliver performance in international markets. 70% of the companies are family controlled, and 70% of all my investors are taxable. That's a terribly important thing because investment if you can find, the goal of an investor is to find something that has the capacity to reinvest without forcing you to have to sell the position and pay taxes when you do so. So anyways, with that start, I welcome you. I'm going to jump over that stuff. Anyways, I first came upon money management when I was a graduate student at Stanford Business and Law School. In 1982, Warren Buffett came to our class. And at the time, he was worth about $140 million. He's now worth $75 billion. The lessons that he shared were the lessons that I continue to aspire to follow, which is that the very first rule in investing is that it's better not to pay taxes. So think about Berkshire Hathaway. When I first came upon the shares, they were trading for $900 a share. Today, they trade for $310,000 a share. $309,100 of that is unrealized capital gains. That would be a 30% tax on that. That would be $100,000 of the position that I hold in Berkshire Hathaway is being invested on my behalf, even though it's the government's money. The moment I sell a share, the government will take the third that they deserve, but until then, I get to use their money without any interest. And so, if you can find a business that is capable of continuing to compound, which is what's required to lift the value going forward, you're well advised to take advantage of it and let the appreciation go untaxed. If that's going to happen, however, you're going to have to reinvest money. You're going to have to find businesses that have the capacity to reinvest. And for me, when Warren came to our class, he said you should find businesses that you find interesting to invest in, because if you're interested in it, you'll invest more. You'll work harder, enjoy it more. For me, the area that I focus on is consumers. We have, I often say to someone, if you want to know what we invest in, go into your kitchen and open up your cabinet. And as you look and you'll see something, you might say, I don't know why I've got baking soda by Arm & Hammer. I don't care why, but the fact is you have it. I do care, actually, because it does serve a need. But the fact is I'm looking for businesses where people have become, by habit and by preference, very brand loyal. And with that brand loyalty, there's a perception that there's not an adequate substitute. And if you have a business which the consumer believes doesn't have an adequate substitute, you have price inelastic demand, which means if you raise prices, the demand won't go away. It's a very rare state in the business world, and you need to have something that distinguishes your product from others in order to enjoy that. But brands are the way to get there. Global brands are particularly interesting because what we're looking for as investors is vast unserved markets. One of our top 3 holdings in MasterCard has the enviable position of being a global leader already. in the payment systems and with a very strong brand and so on and so forth. It happens, however, in the international markets where they compete most effectively. It happens to face markets that are still 85% commerce is settled by cash. They don't use MasterCard. MasterCard's job is to convert the 85% of the commerce that's done around the world for cash into electronic payments. They are assisted along this effort by governments who rightly understand in countries like India that not a single citizen pays a penny of income tax because they are able through the cash economies to structure their lives in a way that nothing is ever reported by anyone. The government understands that, and they've recently confiscated all currencies over a certain value, assuming it to be illegally got and certainly outside the traceability which they need to get tax compliance. So MasterCard's goal is to convert 85% of the world's commerce from cash to credit cards, to payment systems. Governments are their allies because governments want to disperse social benefits. And at the moment, if you send a check to a village in India in support of a single mother with 4 children, she'll have to leave the village, go into town, where she'll meet her erstwhile spouse, who's going to demand half the check when they cash it. The cashier is going to demand a quarter of the check. She'll walk home with 25% of the money intended for her to raise her 4 kids. Alternative system, a payment device receiving distributions via MasterCard's network into a device that can be used in lieu of cash. In most markets, it's called a cellular phone. And MasterCard's deeply engaged in helping governments fulfill that obligation. But the white space is what we call the unserved market. It's 85% of the market, and they're currently only serving 15%. Well, you'd love to have the ability to reinvest in markets like that. We have a similar situation in China, where we sell Martell cognac to a nation that's thirsty for such luxuries, and the combined activities of the companies that we've invested in sell to the Chinese 4 million cases of premium spirits. The Chinese consume 1.5 billion cases. We have less than 1/3 of 1% in that market. Our companies are actively pursuing ways in which they might insert themselves into the conversations of life, but at the moment they've succeeded to the tune of about 0.3 percentage points. That's white space. That gives you the capacity to reinvest mature market cash flows into developing markets. You get the benefit of population growth in those markets. You get the benefit of consumer disposable income in those markets. And what do you need to reinvest? You need to have multilingual management. They have to be able to go to India and speak Hindi. They have to be able to navigate their way through Africa, other markets around the world that speak languages foreign to Lancaster. I'd ask you to raise your hands. How many people here speak 10 languages? 5? 5, you'd be in good company. The top 100 managers of Nestle probably on average speak 5 languages. It's a huge lift. You really have to reinvest with businesses that have multicultural managements. And to that extent, let me see if I've got, yeah, there you are, multicultural. On that extent, for the multicultural test, raise your hand and tell me who your favorite cricket player is. Anyone? 1.7 billion people go to sleep tonight thinking nothing but fond thoughts of their favorite cricket player. Try to compete globally when you go abroad to sell whatever wares you want in English, talking to them about Pete Rose. It's not going to work. The other thing you need the capacity to reinvest, and that's the white space, that's the brands, that's the growing GDP per capita in markets. Think about an example. One of our big markets, my other colleague from the office here is Tierney Werner. She's just returned from Africa. She would have seen this firsthand. In Nigeria, Nestle has a huge business in Maggi, the condiment company, in bouillon cubes. Bouillon in emerging markets is a really affordable and terribly important piece of their budget. The second spouse that goes to work means that the family which once traditionally brewed their own stock by taking all the leftover and stewing it and then saving it, they can't do that when both spouses work in a more urban setting, which is the course of human direction. And so they find that they can get something like what they once used that they made at home in a bouillon cube. And throughout your Africa, throughout the farthest reaches, you will see at retail one bouillon cube. And so when finally the second spouse goes to work and they have a little spending money, they'll buy one bouillon cube. And if they get a raise and if things move along pretty well, someday they'll buy a second one. At that moment, the market just doubled. And it's not a real press to think if you can buy one, then maybe you can buy two. We are in the business of trying to make sure that before the consumer knows that they're going to end up buying what they do, we've built the facilities to serve that demand. Now, the problem with getting out in front of current demand is it does nothing for you but loses money. Everyone here who has a privately run business probably experiences a point in time when they say, I want to add a third line. Well, they don't have enough money, we don't have enough business to serve the needs of a third line. That's okay. We'll take a hit for a while because we want to make sure we don't leave business unattended. That concept in family-run, privately held companies is completely abandoned on Wall Street, where analysts say, you got to show me quarterly numbers. And so if you want to succeed, you have to develop the bullion before the consumer. But that takes an enormous burden on reported income. And Wall Street doesn't allow that. I gave an example. First example, the capacity to suffer. Management worries if they disappoint Wall Street that they will lose their job. In fact, that they worry increasingly today that they will be taken over by an activist firm or by a takeover firm. So unless a business has a family control that will take outside predators out of the picture when management commences on a program burdening current results but destined to increase future wealth, the management will just not make the expenditures, which means the businesses that we find where you have both the brand and the opportunity in the marketplace and family control that says to someone who comes along in the midstream of a project, says, you're losing way too much money, we're going to take you over. The family can say, go away. Happens all the time in our portfolios. And that's extremely valuable. Heineken, I first invested in Heineken in 1986. I went to Amsterdam and the CFO at the time said, why are you here? I said, to invest in your shares. And he said, well, nobody invests in our share. We're a family-controlled company. I said, well, that's perfectly fine. But 30 years later, the shares have grown enormously because the family all along controlled 50.1% of the shares, and they took one step after another, which their competitors chose not to try because they feared their own job loss. If when spending for that new expansion, reported profits would decline. Wall Street would gang up on them, force the management out, take over. Heineken didn't have to suffer that risk. In fact, over time, they've been blessed by the capacity to say no when the market says yes, and the capacity to say yes when the market says no. This is a picture of a market where this phenomenon just expressed itself, I thought, quite elegantly. 5 years ago, Wall Street clamored for Heineken to acquire the second largest brewer in Brazil. They had 12% market share at Heineken. The second largest had 15%. Wall Street said, Heineken, if you buy it, you'll get together 27%. You'll be much more effective against the major competitor. Heineken looked at the business, looked at the price, said no. Wall Street said yes. Heineken said no. They didn't feel any pressure because, after all, if Wall Street tried to do something about their lack of imagination, they'd be rebuffed by the owner family. The business did sell to Kirin, Japanese brewer, desperate to show some kind of activity. They paid $5 billion to buy the business. 4 years later, they decided that they'd lost enough money off of that investment that they wanted to sell it. They came to the marketplace. Wall Street said to Heineken, don't even think about buying it. The answer is no. Heineken ran the numbers and thought it would be a good purchase at $700 million, so they bought it. They had the ability to say no when the market clamored yes. They had the ability to say yes when the market clamored no. And the spread between those two moments, about $4.3 billion. Now, the reason why the market clamored no was because whoever bought Heineken at this stage would have a world of hurt for the next 3 years as they attempted to integrate the two businesses into one operating, jointly run business. And all of Heineken's competitors realized that if they took on this project, they would sacrifice current income in pursuit of long-term wealth, and they didn't have the permission to do that from the shareholders. That is a striking example. In the world of, let me see here, eat what you see in your kitchen cabinet. My wife happens to have grown up in England for the first 6 years of her life, and it was inculcated with a taste for this horrible cereal called Weetabix. Weetabix is a family-controlled company. They lacked, however, the capacity to reinvest. Nobody in the world beyond England's shores would ever want to eat this stuff. And so they had the capacity to suffer. If you look at this sheet, you look on the far, what happened with Weetabix, I invested in the shares just to honor my wife's passion. And the shares, when we bought them, traded for £5.95. You see on the lower right-hand side there, middle of the page, £5.90. Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, £5.95. It's in the box there. They had 19 million in cash, the same column as 1989 when we started. 19 million in cash. 19 million in EBITDA, which is the expression of earnings. 7 million in cash. Over the period that we owned it, the EBITDA went from 19 to 63. It went straight up until 97, 98, at which point it started to wane because around that time there was a the cash was building along the way. It went from 7 million to 75 million. To the end, it was 105 million. And I do mean end because it was actually at the end taken over by a private equity firm. The family that controlled it did not want to risk misspending the 105 million. It's very different than a public company. No public company would let themselves ever show up with $105 million on the balance sheet. Wall Street would say, you are really inefficient in allocating your capital. This family owned the company. They had some outside shareholders like me. I had, by 2003, I owned 20% of the company on behalf of my investors. And at that point, the family, because the cash was trapped, they didn't feel like making an expensive acquisition, they agreed to sell the business. If you think that Wall Street's efficient in pricing the business, the intrinsic value per share, which is the blue line, continued on an upward course. But in 1999, 1988, in the Internet 1.0 bubble, the shares dropped from 40 to 20. In fact, in 2003, the year it was acquired, they dropped well below 20, and the entire business was trading at the time for roughly, what would that have been, 200 million pounds, with 105 million of cash in the business. There is no explanation as to why the market corrected the shares that much, other than the money left Weetabix to go buy the first version of the internet boom. So fast forward, the business was ultimately bought by Chinese, and the mistaken thought that they could get the Chinese to eat the stuff didn't work. didn't work. I'll give you a couple stories, investment stories from Berkshire Hathaway, where I first met Warren, as I said, 1982, and have had the pleasure of going to the annual meeting each year for the last 35, 40 years. And Berkshire's Geico investment is a pretty good example of what it means to have the capacity to suffer. When Berkshire bought Geico, they only had 1 million policyholders. They were making $150 per policyholder. So they were making profits of about $150 million when he bought the company. Now, Geico is a funny beast. It has a very high renewal persistency. As I said, they make $150 per insured, and given net present value, that gives an insured a lifetime value for Berkshire Hathaway of over $2,000. Okay? However, in order to get a new policy onboarded into the system, requires a first-year loss, reported loss of $250. So the math goes like this. Warren buys it with 1 million policyholders. It's making $150 million a year. If he had wished to grow the business by 1 million new insured that second year, his reported profits would have gone from 150 million of profits to a negative 100 million. He would have still made the same money off the million that he had. I'm not giving him any credit for the midstream on the new, but the presence of that new first-year policy group would have burdened that business with $250 million of operating losses. It would have, however, delivered to the company $2 billion worth of net worth, because that's the present value of future profit streams from the insureds who persist with high percentage. Now, Warren, obviously you all know this because you watch television. And for the past decade, you would have seen that every commercial is either on TV in general, not just for Geico, it's either a chameleon or a lizard or it's Billie Jean King or a caveman. But they heavied up the spending. And in the annual report of a couple years ago, Warren said that as a result of the growth in the insured count from 1 million to 11 million, he had added $20 billion of value to Berkshire. The capacity to suffer, the upfront onboarding expense, when in return for that you pick up $2,000 of lifetime value, is an elegant way of expressing what we're in the business of doing, which is taking on enormous business pain up front for long-term gain. And that upfront pain is the investment behind opening up new branches, new regions, new products. And the long term is based on the belief that if we spend a proper amount, that we'll develop brands that the consumer will trust, and they'll then use them frequently, and then they'll have a lifetime value. And that's the math. Wall Street's math is entirely different. It's about finding things that you can trade, looking for businesses that make the numbers, and it's an empty diet over time. Aside from that cheery outlook, let me move on to any questions. I think I've given you a sense. There are dozens of examples of how this phenomenon unfolds. I have been told that this room clears out at 1:30 on the dot. So I'll answer any questions that you might have.